after the '62 campaign, which President Nixon lost
Right.
during the governor's race,
Right.
how did you reconnect with Richard Nixon
okay.
after that?
Okay, Nixon went back to New York and started in a practice of law. Didn't have any assistance other than Rosemary Woods, any political assistance. Eventually, there were a couple people in the law firm who were interested in him and were helpful, like Len Garment, John Sears. But I continued to be a person he would call on if he was giving a big speech or writing a big article, and that went on for, I guess I did it for 3 years. In '65, it was a rather interesting story. This, as you know, Republican politicians take off around the country for Lincoln Day weekends, fundraisers everywhere, and you always want a Nixon or a Rockefeller or a Dole to be out there. So he was to go out in '65 around the country. It happened that right before that, I was ghosting an article for Reader's Digest that had to do with the aviation firm, plane maker in Marietta, Georgia. It'll come to me in a minute. At any rate, it had to do with that firm. And a plane was to pick me up in Washington and take me to Marietta, Georgia. When the plane arrived, Hubert Humphrey, who was the vice president, got out of the plane. I got in, and I called Nixon and I said, hey, you know, this big company, was it Boeing? No, Boeing's on the West Coast. Offered their plane courtesy to a Democratic vice president. I'm sure they'd offer it to a Republican vice president if you bother to call them. So he did, and they offered the plane to him for our trip. And we got on the plane and discovered that it was Pussy Galore's plane from the James Bond movie. You know, it was a great plane. So we were on the plane, myself, 2 reporters joined us. John Whitaker, who was actually a geologist from Washington, who was very close to Nixon, and made himself available for advance work. So we were all on the plane. And ultimately, on the way back, the plane stopped in Buffalo to refuel. And Nixon asked me to walk with him on the tarmac. He had something on his mind. When we got back on the plane, John Whitaker was curious, what was going on? And I said, well, Nixon asked me to come to New York to work for him. Oh? And I said I had to refuse him. I've got a life and a family and connections in Washington. I just couldn't get up and move to New York. And John Whitaker said, well, that ends your relationship with Nixon. And I said, what do you mean? We've got a lovely relationship. Whitaker knew Nixon better than I did. There was a difference, as with all politicians, by the way, not just Nixon, between an inner circle and those who stepped out of the inner circle. At that moment, when I turned him down to come to New York, I had stepped out of the inner circle. The inner circle were the people, when you decide to, considering running for governor, you invite 6 people to the Waldorf Towers to discuss it. That's the inner circle. We remained friends, and useful friends, but I never again was in that inner circle. So that changed my relationship, the intensity of my relationship with Nixon. I was sad about it because, among other things, it's nice to have a famous friend. You walk into a restaurant and everybody looks at you, and the chef brings you things that aren't on the menu, and it's just a little different world. You learn secrets that you didn't know previously, and it was fun being close to Nixon. I was so substantially, I was on the White House staff. I did lots of things with Nixon, but in truth, it wasn't the same after '65. The funny part about that little story is that Pat Buchanan, who was slightly younger than I and was working on a newspaper in St. Louis, when he was here at the Nixon Library, and I heard him on television, he talked at great length about how he wooed Nixon because he wanted a job. He arranged to be someplace when Nixon was coming to St. Louis. He then bombarded him with memos and so forth, and he thought he was quite successful. He got a job. What he didn't know, or probably doesn't know to this day, he got a job because I had turned down a job and there was a job opening there. So I've always kidded myself to say, what would have happened if I had to Pat Moynihan, to Pat Buchanan, if in fact I had accepted Dick Nixon's offer in 1965. I'm sure he would have done very well in life, but it might have been a little different.